Is that food?
It's raw fish, yeah. It's a food. It's just
Oh yeah.
but it means it's very much
How do you know
people.
what?
Yeah, people.
Oh,
Everybody eats it.
so maybe don't like. More, more maybe don't like.
I think what
One thing like is more.
It's pleasing social category.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Volvo is a car,
Oh, car.
so it's people driving Volvo.
Okay. It's made in Japan.
It's made in Sweden.
Oh, Sweden. Okay.
Real time Sweden. People reading all the time. It's got the box section. Sorry?
Sweden. Okay, okay.
Where are you from?
I know. Where you?
I'm Switzerland.
Sweden. Oh yeah. I see. From your listen. I guess you saw the
Yeah.
nose. Europe.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah,
yeah. I meet some friends from German.
yeah.
Have some just like.
You're studying here?
Oh no, I'm a fellow. I'm a research fellow
Ah, yeah, okay.
in this school.
Okay.
You too? In this month. This month's car. My name is Wu.
Hangi ayakkabı? Deri ayakkabı boyası tabii.
Oh, I come here at September last year. So I went to stay here for 1 year. And then now 6 months has passed. I will stay here now the 6 months. Yeah. Yeah, it's very good. It's very good. There are many leaves here. And many females people come here. Also a teacher. Most of the professors and teacher
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Dan Glickman, the director of the Institute of Politics, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here. Last semester, many of you joined us here in the forum as we hosted all the major Democratic candidates for president with Chris Matthews and Hardball. And if there are any Kucinich supporters in the room, he didn't come, so that's why I said all the major Democratic candidates for president. In any event, it was an extremely interesting and enjoyable series, but because we take our nonpartisan role seriously here, this semester we've made a concerted effort to reach out to Republican and conservative leaders in order to provide a balance on the key policy issues facing this great country. And to give you an example, later this semester we are bringing Bush-Cheney campaign manager Ken Mehlman here and the Republican National Committee Finance Chair Jack Oliver here. But tonight the Institute of Politics is pleased to partner with the Harvard Republican Club, which I'm told is the oldest and largest college Republican group in the country, and the Kennedy School Republican Caucus to host one of the most articulate and influential voices on the issue of taxes and the size of government. His philosophy, Stephen's philosophy, is clear. He believes that taxes are too high and that government is too big. The debate he engages in, the debate on taxes and government, is not a new one. Plato wrote in the Republic, "When there is an income tax, the just man will pay more and the unjust less on the same amount of income." Or over the years, many a student of Plato changed their minds. Will Rogers wrote, "The income tax has made more liars out of the American people than golf has." The fundamental fact is, however, that whether or not any of us likes to pay taxes, without taxation, there is probably no realistic civilization. As former Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker may have said it best, the unavoidable fact is that government has certain responsibilities. The discharge of those responsibilities costs money. And our guest this evening forces all of us to ask ourselves, both at the state and the federal level, what are these responsibilities? How many responsibilities can we afford? What responsibilities should be handled by individuals instead of by the government? These are important questions to ask. Eventually, especially as the budget deficit climbs and our national debt increases, these questions will be at the forefront of any political debate, certainly in this presidential election. To introduce tonight's speaker is IOP fellow Lynn Sweet. Lynn is the Washington bureau chief for the Chicago Sun-Times and has invited Stephen Moore to Harvard, as well as to her study group later on tonight, which will follow the forum tonight. Let me introduce Lynn Sweet.
Thank you, Dan. Well, our guest here might seem mild-mannered, but in reality, Steve Moore is a militant anti-tax activist. He's here tonight to make the case for permanent lower taxes, but in so doing, I want you to know he does have a sense of humor. Moore was the man behind the ad that the Club for Growth had that described Howard Dean as the tax-hiking, government-expanding, latte-drinking, sushi-eating, Volvo-driving, New York Times-reading Democrat who should take his body-piercing, Hollywood-loving, left-wing freak show back to Vermont. Moore, a tax and budget expert, is an unrelenting crusader against high taxes and big government. He operates on several fronts. He's the president of the Club for Growth, which is emerging in the 2004 election cycle as one of the central shadow parties. He is a fellow at the Cato Institute, an alumni of the Heritage Foundation, a contributing editor at the National Review and a variety of other publications, and he's a frequent guest on television political talk shows. Moore is a Republican, but he's a renegade who does not play by the conventional rules of the party. He's fearless about going after moderate Republicans who not share, and I'm paraphrasing here, the Reagan vision of limited government and lower taxes. Such Republicans in Steve Moore's books are rhinos, Republicans in name only. Moore, as I am, is a native of Illinois. He comes from a suburb of Chicago called Wilmette. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois, majoring in economics. And for students here who wonder, can professors make a difference in your lives? Steve was deeply influenced by the teaching of his economic professor, Julian Simon, which led him on a career course that took him to Washington. He then went on to have a master's in economics from George Mason University. So please join me tonight in welcoming Stephen Moore.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lynn, for the nice introduction, and thank you, Secretary Glickman, for having me. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. I haven't been back to Harvard since, I think it was 1979 when I was in the high school debate program and came here for one of the programs and had a wonderful time. So it's great to be back in Cambridge. Lynn mentioned the fact that I run a group called the Club for Growth. We've been getting a lot of phone calls at our office lately, people asking, is this the place where you can get that hair replacement tonic? The growth we're after is not hair, it's economic growth. And so we get involved in a lot of the races around the country.
I can leave.
That's what you came for, right? So anyway, we are very involved in races, and it's funny that you all mentioned the Howard Dean ad that we ran. That was sort of obviously meant to be humorous and try to just unsettle the Dean people a little bit. And one of the funny things that happened about that ad was that after it started running, and we actually didn't spend all that much money running that ad, but it was one of those ads that just became part of the culture, and it ran over on CNN and all these stations. And so we got a letter from the head of the North American sales for Volvo, saying, how dare you say that only liberals drive Volvos? And so I said, does this mean we're not going to get a contribution this year? One of the things I'm doing that's really fun, I'm going to talk about the Bush tax cut, but I thought one thing I'd just tell you is that the kind of highlight for the year for me has been working with Governor Terminator in California. I was very involved with Arnold during the campaign. I was one of his economic advisors, and that was kind of a thrill. And then after he won, he had called me up to be on his budget team to try to balance this budget in California. And honest to God's truth, it was the evening of Halloween, and I was about to take my 10 and 9-year-old out trick-or-treating. It was about 6:30 at night, and the phone rings, and this woman on the phone says, is this Steve Moore? And I said, it is. And he said, can you hold on and take a call from Governor-elect Schwarzenegger? So I said, sure. And you don't say no to the Terminator. And so I say to my kids, guys, hurry, get on the phone. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger on the phone. So they get on the other line, and Arnold says, Steve, I need you to come to Sacramento and help me balance the budget in California. And so we're going on with this very sophisticated conversation about how we were going to deal with the budget crisis. And in the middle of the conversation, my 9-year-old says, is this really Arnold Schwarzenegger? And it was Arnold said, get off the phone, son, or I'm going to terminate you. So that's been a lot of fun, and that's been a challenge, by the way. What I'm going to talk for a few minutes about is how taxes matter and why it's so important to make the Bush tax cuts permanent. And if you want a very visible evidence of how taxes matter, all you have to do is look at California. California, in my opinion, has suffered this incredible economic implosion. Partly because they have these incredibly high tax rates, very high anti-business regulatory policies, and it's become a state that is highly hostile to wealth creation and business. And California, as I said, has the third highest tax rates in the country. And what has happened, if you want to look at what really caused the budget crisis in California, I was just looking at these statistics, gathering them for the governor a few weeks ago. If you go back to 1999, when California had a budget surplus, there were 50,000 millionaires living in California in 1999. Today, there are 30,000 millionaires living in California. So about 40% of all the millionaires either have lost their money or they've moved out of the state. And I happen to think that a lot of it is people moving out of the state. And if you look at just those 20,000 millionaires who've left the state, those 20,000 people account for about $8 billion in lost revenues for California. So if they could only find a way to just bring back the people who've left, they would be able to pretty closely rebalance the budget. And of course, the reason that wealthy people are leaving the state is because the policies are very hostile to wealth creation. And California has a 10%, roughly a 10% local and state income tax. You can move across the border, 100 miles and go into Nevada and pay a 0 income tax. So, what you're seeing out west is towns like Reno and Las Vegas are just booming as all these new housing establishments are being started up, as the wealthy people who made money in California are now leaving for more tax hospitable places. So I think it's a real good case study about the fact that taxes really do matter. They do influence policy, and in the case of California, they matter a whole heck of a lot. I was debating on an NPR station in San Francisco a few days ago. By the way, think about the NPR in San Francisco. You can't get much more left-wing than that. And so this woman I was debating was the majority leader in the San Francisco Senate. And we were talking about the budget crisis. She said, you're talking about how we have to cut this program and that program. We Democrats think the way that we can deal with this budget crisis is simply by raising taxes on the rich and businesses. And, I thought about it, and I thought, she's this woman, she just doesn't have her tray table in its upright and locked position. I mean, if you look at what's happening in California right now, you can't, if you were to raise taxes on businesses and high wealth individuals, I'm convinced you would lose revenue, you wouldn't gain it. In other words, in my opinion, California's already on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. I actually think that this is one state where if they were to cut tax rates, they could probably increase revenues, not gain them. Now, let me talk a little bit about the Bush tax cut and why I think it's so important. And I think the way to understand why this tax cut was such an important element to the economic recovery we're in right now, and I think that we're in a very strong economic recovery. If I have one beef with the administration right now, I think you said you're going to have Ken Melman here in a few weeks. The one thing I would tell Ken is don't back down. Don't be timid on your economic agenda because it's working. Now, that's maybe a strange thing to say with what's happened in the last week or so with the stock market not doing very well, but if you go back to when the tax cut took effect, I'm talking about the 2003 tax cut, which was the real supply-side tax cut. The economic evidence is overwhelmingly positive since May of 2003. And just to give you a few statistics, the economy, the GDP, since May of 2003 has grown at a 5.6% annualized rate. 5.6%. That's an awesome rate of economic activity. If you look at what's happened, if I think that another very strong indicator of how well the economy is doing is the stock market. And one of the points that a lot of us made when we were trying to sell this plan to the president is that what we need to do to get the economy turned around is to put value back into stocks. And a lot of us, people like, when we'd go on TV, people like me or Larry Kudlow or Art Laffer or other supply-siders, we would make the case that if you put in place this Bush tax cut, and you cut the capital gains tax, and you cut the dividend tax, and you brought income tax rates down, that this would cause almost an immediate increase in the valuation of stocks, and that you would see this immediate increase in the valuation of stocks reflected in, obviously, the stock market. And we predicted, based on companies that were paying dividends versus capital gains stocks and so on, that you would see about a 15% increase in stock values. Boom. The minute you sign this law into effect, stocks would rise by about that much. And in fact, we were wrong. Stocks did not rise by 10 to 15%. They've risen by about 25%. 2003 was one of the best years for the stock market that we've had in many years. And so I think if you look at what the objective of the tax cut was to do, which was to increase investment, it's been an unparalleled success. Now, let me back up for a minute, because I think you have to understand what it was, why the economy did so poorly in the years 2001 and 2002 to understand why we needed to do this tax cut in 2003. I think this was probably one of the most misunderstood recessions that our country has had in many, many years. It was a very unconventional or atypical recession. This was not a kind of Keynesian recession. And in normal Keynesian recessions, as many of you know who are economics majors, what drives the recession is a reduction in consumption, either consumption by businesses or consumption by households. That didn't happen in 2001 and 2002. In fact, as most of you know, if you look at retail sales and consumer spending during the period when the economy was performing so poorly, guess what? Consumers continued to shop and they continued to buy things. And in fact, there was no recession whatsoever in the amount of buying behavior by American households. What happened in 2001 and 2002 that caused the economy to go into a tailspin was the stock market crash. I think that was sort of the seminal event that caused this very weak economy. Now, to put that stock market crash into some perspective, let's look at the numbers. If you go back to around the summer of 2000, and you look at where the NASDAQ and the Dow Jones were at, I mean, the NASDAQ hit its high point in May of 2000. I think it briefly went over 6,000. I may be wrong about that, but it was between 5,000 and 6,000. The NASDAQ fell from the 5,000 to 6,000 range down to a low of about 1,500. That is a catastrophic decline in asset values to go from, that basically means that there was about a 70% decline in asset values. Now, a lot of that was just attributable, as you all know, to the stock market bubble. And the best example of the stock market bubble was, for example, Amazon. If you look at where Amazon was in late 1999, Amazon was selling at $100 a share. Now, if you looked at the market capitalization of Amazon in 1999, when it was selling at $100 a share, the market capitalization value of Amazon was greater than the value of every book that had ever been sold since the printing press had been invented. So what I think that's telling you is that Alan Greenspan was right. There was an irrational exuberance in the stock market. The Dow Jones hit a high point of over 11,000 and it fell to less than 8,000. So even in the Dow, you saw about 40% decline in equity values. Well, what did that mean for American businesses and American consumers, that dramatic decline in stock values? What it meant is that because we have become a mass investor society, and I think that's a very healthy thing, that now 55% of Americans have stocks. This is sort of what we call the new investor class. This meant that Americans' household wealth was falling very rapidly when the stock market fell. And to put that number in perspective, the total loss of wealth due to the stock market collapse was about $5 trillion. 5 trillion with a T. That's bigger than the gross domestic product of virtually every country in the world. So this was a massive liquidation in the wealth of American households. And it meant that businesses were very unlikely to invest in that kind of environment where you had people losing money and businesses losing money hand over foot. So our advice to the White House was, I actually thought the 2001 tax cut that we did was your kind of classic Keynesian tax cut that made no economic sense. All we did in 2001, as you may recall, remember we did the rebate where we gave people, $100 or $200, $300, in some cases $400 rebates. That never seemed to make much sense to me, because the problem wasn't that Americans didn't have enough money in their pockets. It was that their wealth was declining. And so when the president decided in 2003 that he wanted to do a tax cut to really get the economy going, he called into the White House. There were about 12 economists from around the country that he met with, and I was privileged to be one of those 12. And one of the things we told President Bush was that it was really essential that you put value back into stocks by cutting the capital gains tax, by cutting the dividend tax, by bringing income tax rates down, and so on. And President Bush, to his credit, really latched onto this idea. As you may recall, the president's original proposal was to eliminate the dividend tax, which I think is a great idea, because the dividend tax, as you all know, is a double taxation on investment income. And if you're going to tax the corporate profits, you shouldn't tax the dividends, or else if you're going to tax the dividends, you shouldn't tax the corporate profits. And so the president came out with, I think, an excellent plan. We did a lot of compromising, and in the end, I think we got what I view as the single best pro-growth tax cut bill that has passed in this country since Reagan's very famous 1981 tax cut, where we cut the income tax rates across the board. Now, if you look at the I want to emphasize one factor about the Bush tax cut. I just want to walk you through the logic of why it is that when we cut the capital gains tax and when we cut the dividend tax, why it is that stocks had to rise. And it's important to understand this because if you understand that point, then you'll understand how economically dysfunctional it would be if you had, say, a President Kerry scenario and Kerry came in and actually repealed the cut in the capital gains and dividend tax. Now, let's start with this. When you think about let me ask you all in this audience, how many of you actually own stocks? Raise your hand if you're a stockholder. So most of you do, and you have some knowledge about how stocks are chosen and also how stocks are valued. So I would ask you the most simple of all questions, and I'm just going to open this up to you all. How does the market determine the value of a share of stock? Or the valuation of a company, for that matter. What is a share value based on? Come on, you're all shareholders. What determines how a share price is determined? Earnings. Thank you, Dan. Earnings, exactly. So when you buy a share of stock, you're basically looking at the earnings in year one, and then the projected earnings in year 2, and year 3, and year 4, and year 5. Out ad infinitum. And then what you're doing is you're basically discounting them because, as you all know, $1 is worth more today than $1 10 years or 20 years from now. So you're looking at what we economists call the discounted present value earnings of that company, and then you come up with a valuation. Now, so for example, if a company is making $10 a year in earnings from now until forever, you just take that $10 stream of income and you discount it, and you're going to come up with a valuation. Maybe it's $100. Now, I left something out of the equation that's very important when you're looking at what the stock is worth, and that is taxes. Because as an investor, you're not interested in your before-tax rate of return, you're interested in your after-tax rate of return. And so what we did when we cut the capital gains tax and we cut the dividend tax is all of a sudden we're increasing the after-tax rate of return on the earnings, right? Because now instead of the earnings being taxed at, say, 40% through dividends, now they're only being taxed at 15%. And so if you follow the logic, as the after-tax share return on those earnings rises, what has to happen to the values of the shares? They have to rise, right? I mean, if the market is correctly valuing these shares, if you cut the capital gains tax and the dividend tax, the market's value of the stocks has to rise, and that's precisely what happened. Now I want to get to the next point, which is if the Congress came in next year and said, you know what, we can't afford to do these tax cuts anymore, we're going to have to give them back, and we all of a sudden said, you know what, we're not going to tax capital gains at 15% anymore, we're going to tax them at 20%, and we're not going to tax dividends at 15% anymore, we're going to tax them at 40%. Now what's going to happen to the value of shares? It's going to fall, right? It has to, because now all of a sudden you've reduced the after-tax rate of return. So that, in my opinion, was really what I consider really the pillar of the Bush tax cut. The jewel of the plan was cutting the capital gains tax and dividends tax. And we have to keep market values up, because if shares continue to fall, it could have very negative consequences on the economy, especially if something were to happen to housing. Because, as you know, Americans, when it comes to their ownership, they really have two principal means of wealth. Their shares of stocks and their housing. The one thing that's really kept us going through this whole traumatic experience that we've had over the last few years is at least that housing values have stayed very high. So even when people were losing money in the stock market, because housing values were continuing to rise, for most Americans, they weren't, their net wealth wasn't falling altogether. If we were to see stocks fall and housing fall, I think we could have some really negative consequences for the economy. So that's point number one, is that we've got to keep the tax cut in place to keep stocks high. Second of all, we have to keep the tax cut in place because of business investment. You know, one of the things that I find perplexing about the economic debate on the Democratic side of the aisle, and I've been watching a lot of those debates, I think I watched some of the debates that you had here, Dan, with the candidates, is, look, I don't think there's anybody who can deny that the number one objective for our economy right now is to create more jobs. We've got to create more jobs, and we've got to create better paying jobs. I think if President Bush was up here right now, he'd be saying the same thing. What I don't understand when I listen to John Kerry or Howard Dean or Kucinich or any of these guys is if they're saying the first thing I want to do out of the gates is repeal these tax cuts, how in the world is repealing tax cuts going to create jobs? My old boss, Dan and I were talking a little bit before the program started, and I mentioned to him that I worked with for Dick Armey back in the mid-1990s. And Dick Armey used to say that liberals love jobs, but they hate employers. And you can't have one without the other. And so when you look at those tax cuts, for example, if you look at the people who are in the top 1%, let's talk about those folks, the evil rich. It turns out that the people who pay the highest income tax rate in the country today, the people who are in the 35 to 40% income tax bracket, guess what? 2 out of every 3 of those people who are in the highest income tax bracket are small business owners. Now, it's also true that about 70% of all jobs in this country come from small businesses. So if you're going to raise taxes on small businesses and you're going to raise taxes on their investment in equipment and machinery and technology and so on, how in the world are you going to create jobs? And that is the single most important question that George Bush has to ask John Kerry is, how are you going to create jobs if you're going to raise taxes on the very businesses that you want to create them? I'll make one last point, because I probably talked for about 20 minutes already, which is that, this is the Kennedy School, and we ran some TV ads back when the Bush plan was being debated, and there was a lot of debate about whether this would actually be enacted, because it only passed by 1 vote in the Senate, and it passed narrowly in the House. And we ran some ads in a number of states where we pointed out that, in fact, what Bush was proposing was not much different from what John F. Kennedy had proposed 40 years ago. And if you go back and read some of the speeches that John F. Kennedy gave when he did his very famous tax cut that was enacted shortly after his death, Kennedy sounded like the original supply-sider. In fact, Reagan stole a lot of his rhetoric and a lot of his program from exactly what Kennedy had done 40 years ago. And you're probably all familiar with this, but it was Kennedy who said things like, "A rising tide lifts all boats," and that and he also was very famous for saying that when the tax rates are too high, the country will never create enough jobs or enough revenues to balance the budget. And you know what? He was right about that. Now, back then we had 90% tax rates, but it was Kennedy who basically said we're going to cut the highest tax rate from 90 to 70%. He also cut the capital gains tax, he cut the dividend tax, and so on. And it was a smashing success. The economy surged in the wake of the Kennedy tax cut. Then we come along to the Reagan tax cuts in the 1980s. And in 1981, when people talk about the job problem in the United States and the fact that we don't have enough jobs, it's true, but when I graduated from college in 1982, in the summer of 1982, the unemployment rate in the United States was not 5.5%, it was 8.5%. So you couldn't even get a job as a college graduate back then as a burger flipper at McDonald's. I mean, there were just no jobs. You want to talk about deindustrializing, and we were losing hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs a month back then. Part of that was a result of the very high inflation that you may recall from the late 1970s. Some of you probably weren't even born in the late 1970s, but at that time, inflation hit a high point in 1980 at 13.5%. The old joke back in 1980 was that if you found $1 lying on the floor, you'd pick it up to see if there was anything of value lying underneath it, because the dollar had eroded so much in value. Well, Reagan comes in, we cut the highest income tax rate from 70% down to 50%. And then a few years later, we followed that up with another tax cut that brought the highest income tax rate down from 50 to 28%. Now, if you think about it, that is a gigantic reduction in tax rates. That means that the highest tax rate went from 70% down to 28%. Now, the question I would ask to you is, what happened to tax revenues over that period? If you look from 1980 to 1990, you think income tax revenues went up or down? They went up. In fact, they went way up. Total tax receipts went from $500 billion to $1 trillion, even with tax rates falling very dramatically. Now, I'll end with this, and that is the question, why is it that tax rates matter? Why is it that supply-siders like me keep saying we have to bring tax rates down as rapidly as possible? And it has to do with what economics is all about, which is incentives. And if you look back at the structure, I mean, think about for a minute what it means to have a 90% tax rate, which is what we had in the 1960s. If you have a 90% tax rate, what it means is that for every additional dollar that you earn, either working or investing, for every additional dollar you earn, you get to keep 10 cents, right, because it's a 90% tax rate, and the government gets 90 cents. That is a significant disincentive to invest. That's one of the reasons why people found all sorts of tax shelters away around those high rates. By just cutting the top tax rate from 90 to 70%, it meant rather than just keeping 10 cents on the dollar, you get to keep 30 cents on the dollar. Now, I wasn't a math major, but when you increase people's after-tax rate of return from 10 cents to 30 cents, you're tripling their incentive to make income. And it worked also with Reagan as well. Bringing those tax rates down from 70 to 28% meant that now, instead of keeping 30 cents on the dollar, investors get to keep 72 cents on the dollar. What happened in those years? We had this massive infusion of foreign capital in the United States, because now all of a sudden the United States was a very investment-friendly place to invest. One of the reasons the trade deficit went up so dramatically in the 1980s and through the 90s is because the trade deficit, the mirror image of the trade deficit is something called a capital import surplus. And we've been, over the last 20 years, just sucking in capital from the rest of the world. So for all these reasons, I think that we have to keep the Bush tax cut in place. We had to move very aggressively towards a flat tax system. And I think one of the ingeniousness of what President Bush is doing in tax policy in a kind of quiet way is he's moving us towards a flat tax one step at a time. Because if you think about the flat tax idea, and I worked with Dick Armey back in the mid-90s in putting the original flat tax in place. By the way, Dan, you mentioned that when you became Agriculture Secretary, I think it was Leon Panetta who called you up and asked you if you wanted the job. And you may or may not know this, but Leon Panetta back in the 1970s was actually one of the sponsors of the flat tax. So one of the things I've been trying to do is convince people that this is an idea that really can be embraced by Democrats and Republicans. But the idea is bring the tax rates down as much as possible. If you come away from this talk with no other message than this, please remember this, that the essence of a good tax policy is a broad tax base and low tax rates. Broad base, low rates. And that's what the flat tax tries to do. It tries to bring rates down, but it tries to get rid of all the pollution and the garbage and the tax loopholes in the system. And the other thing that the flat tax tries to do is it tries to get rid of all the double and triple and quadruple rates of tax on saving and investment in the tax system, because saving and investment are the building blocks for a growing economy, and we have a very punitive system even still with respect to double and triple taxing saving and investment. So by bringing the capital gains tax down, by bringing the dividend tax down, by bringing tax rates down on income, you're sort of flattening out the system, you're getting rid of the double taxation, and I think that's a very powerful tool for economic growth in this country. One final point, and then I will stop, and that is this. That the strongest or the most persistent argument that's been made against the Bush tax cut, and you'll be hearing about this ad infinitum over the next 6 to 9 months as this election season rolls on, is this whole idea of the two Americas, that we have an America for rich people and we have America for everybody else who's falling behind. And I think that this is a real cancerous kind of creed of the left, that everything is based on this kind of class warfare idea that we want to divide America into two groups, rich and poor. And I think it's rather foolish, actually. I mean, there was a guy quoted in the Wall Street Journal the other day when he was asked about the tax cuts. He was just a gardener, and he said, well, you know what? He said, I've never been hired by a poor person. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, he said, I don't care too much about tax cuts for the rich because rich people are the ones who do the hiring in this economy. But maybe the best guy who dealt with this issue, and I will end with this, is my favorite modern day American philosopher, and I'm talking, of course, about Charles Barkley, Do you all know Charles Barkley, the basketball player? Well, Barkley, for those of you who don't know Charles, he's a very colorful African-American. He was a dream team player in the mid-1980s and played for many years in the NBA and was a Hall of Famer, and he's now talking about maybe running for governor someday. And so one time after right before the 1996 elections, after a Houston Rockets game, an ESPN announcer asked Charles in the locker room who he was going to vote for in the election. Well, this was kind of an odd question to ask a basketball player, but when he asked this, all the cameras and all the microphones were stuck in Charles' face to hear what he was going to say. And so Barkley, in his own inimitable way, sort of scratched his bald head and he said, I think I'm going to probably vote for Bob Dole. This was when Dole was running against Clinton. So he says that, so finally there's this stunned silence in the room. And Barkley says he's going to vote for Dole. And half of the jaws in the room have just dropped practically to the floor. And so finally this announcer breaks this stunned silence by saying, Charles, did you just say you were going to vote for Bob Dole for president? And he said, yeah, I think I probably am. He said, don't you understand, Charles, that Bob Dole is a Republican? And don't you understand, Charles, that Republicans just care about rich people? And Charles said, well, you dumbass, I am rich. And I think that's the only way to deal with some of this class warfare rhetoric. And with that, thank you again, Mr. Secretary, for having me. It's a great privilege to be here.
Well, thank you, Stephen, very much. Now we get a chance to ask questions. We have 2 mics right here. We also have, we have mics up there as well. So the only thing I ask of you is please ask your questions. Do not make a long statement or a philosophical statement if possible, because there are a lot of people who want to have that chance of doing it. If you could state your name and where you go to school here would be great as well. And we'll start right here first, and we'll go around the room like that. So this gentleman right here.
Hi, Mr. Moore. My name is Josh. I'm a freshman at the college. And my question is this. You talked a lot about tax cuts tonight, and that's great. I mean, everybody loves tax cuts, and the Republicans do very well when you run on tax cuts. But it seems to me that when you cut taxes, one of 2 things has to happen. Either the economic growth that results has to create enough new money in tax revenue to make up for the money that you lost, or you have to cut social programs. And Republicans don't do as well when they run on cutting social programs. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, do you think the Bush tax cuts will eventually create enough new tax money to cover the huge deficit we have now, or will you eventually have to cut social programs? And if so, when are the Republicans going to run on that in the election?
Well, I hope both. I hope they generate enough revenues, to balance the budget, and I hope we cut social programs. I'm very libertarian in my views, so the more that we can cut government, the better. But let me just say a couple things about that. We're all concerned about the budget deficit, and these are huge deficits. And when Secretary Glickman and the Clinton administration left the White House, we had $300 billion surpluses, and now we've got I think it was about a $200 to $300 billion surplus, and now we've got deficits that are between $400 and $500 billion. These are very worrisome numbers. There's no question about it. But I would just say a couple things about these deficits, because we really have to understand where they came from and how we're going to get out of this situation. When you look at the numbers on the budget, we have had negative revenue growth for 4 straight years. That is to say, each year from 2001 to 2004, the revenues have been less than they were the year before. That is and by the way, only a portion of that is a result of the tax cut. Most of it is because of the poor economic performance that we've had. The recession, and this was even in normal recessions, you don't see negative revenue growth for as long as we've had. So it's been a kind of mystery to economists about why it is that this recession has had such a profoundly negative impact on tax revenues. And part of the answer is that when you look at those things like capital gains receipts, receipts from the dividend tax and so on, because of the stock market collapse that I talked about, we went from about $150 billion a year in revenues from capital gains down to like $30 billion a year. So the point I'm trying to make here is it may not be enough to grow the economy to balance the budget, but it certainly is a precondition. In other words, there's no way we're balancing this budget unless we stay on a 4 to 5% growth path. Because if you've got negative revenue growth, and the spending is going up even slightly, but it's going up fast, those lines are never going to intersect, right? And so I think that would be my first point, and that's the point we made to President Bush, is look, the first thing we got to do is get this economy moving, and the tax cut is a significant part of that. Now, the second part of your question is, what do we do about the expenditure side? And this is where, I'm almost embarrassed to call myself a Republican. And if you look at what's happened with the expenditures, we have had to spend a lot of money on the war on terrorism. And I think everybody in this room would agree that when it comes to this war on terrorism, you spend whatever it takes. We have to spend whatever it takes to defeat the terrorists. Now, this has been a big hole in the budget. I mean, it's costing us $100 to $200 billion a year to fight terrorism. I happen to think that, I think there's ways you can cut the defense budget, no question about it. But it is important that we do the war on terrorism. The other part of the equation has been the runaway domestic programs. We have had the largest agriculture subsidy program passed by a Republican Congress and a Republican president. The biggest education bill passed by a Republican Congress. We just last year passed a new $500 billion Medicare bill. $500 billion. I said to the people who voted for that, you can vote for this, but if you vote for this bill, you can never open your mouth about the deficit again, because you can't, be sanctimonious about these enormous deficits and vote for the biggest new social program since Lyndon Johnson was in the White House. So I think we need to do both. We've got to get tight on the spending, and we've got to get the budget growth under control.
There, yes, sir.
Oh,
Hi,
sure. Yeah, hi.
my name's Leif Dorms, Joe. I'm an MPP student at the Kennedy School. And I wondered if instead of speculating on the migratory patterns of millionaires and divining schemes to pump up the stock market, it might be more prudent for government to focus on the ingredients that have made our economy the envy of the world, namely by avoiding inflationary spending on foreign wars, creating broad economic gains, fostering business development in small business, not Fortune 500 companies, and by strengthening corporate governance rules. What are your thoughts on that, sir?
Good question. I'm not an expert on the military, so I'm not going to even, deal with the issue about whether this war is right or not. You can get another speaker to talk about that. But I will say this, you're right. Small business is the heart of our economy. And if you want to help small businesses, doing things like cutting the capital gains tax is just essential. I mean, a lot of small businesses now, especially in areas like the high-tech industry, they are funded by venture capitalists. And venture capital is very sensitive to the capital gains rate, because most small businesses, basically 2 out of every 3 of them fail. They don't succeed, they fail. So for the people who put up the funding for small businesses, they're taking a real risk with their capital. And what you have to do is you have to make a lot of money on the ones that succeed to subsidize the cost of the ones that you fail. I mean, same thing, for example, in the pharmaceutical industry. Just to give you one example, every new drug that comes on the market and deals with some ailment or illness or disease, for every drug that makes a profit, there are about 100 that are paid for by venture capitalists and the drug companies that lose money. So, you have to have a high return on that one or two that hit the jackpot, or else you're not going to have the money to have the investment. So I'd say, cut the capital gains tax. As I mentioned before, who pays the highest income tax rate? Those are small business owners. So let's get the highest tax rate down as much as possible. I think if we do those things, we can grow this economy.
Yes, sir. Right there.
Hi.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
up
Hi.
there.
Hi, Mr. Moore. My name is Henry. I'm a student at the Kennedy School.
Hi.
If it is so important that we make the tax cuts permanent now, then why in 2003 did President Bush make them temporary?
Well, because this is kind of an arcane point, but the way the budget rules work now is that if you pass a law that affects the budget, if it's within 10 years, then you only need 51 votes in the Senate to pass it. If it's more than 10 years, then you need 60 votes in the Senate. So we didn't have 60 votes. We barely had 51 to pass this thing. So all of these tax cuts expire in 2011. A lot of them expire sooner than that. And so there's going to be a big battle royale this year and next year about making those tax cuts permanent. And, you know, I would say this about those tax cuts. If you look at the elements of the tax cuts, the parts I didn't talk about was that for all the talk about this being this giant tax cut for rich people, you know, if you're a family with an income of $60,000 a year, which is not rich, and you have 2 kids, so, you know, this is your basic middle-class family, $60,000 with 2 kids, you're going to get $2,200 a year in savings on your taxes from this tax cut because you get the $500 per child credit and you get the lower income tax rates. Well, that's a big deal for people. And that's one of the reasons I actually think that Howard Dean blew up in Iowa, was people said, wait a minute, you know, because he wanted to cancel the whole Bush tax cut, and people said, wait a minute, we Democrats can't run in November 2004 saying we're going to raise every middle-class family's taxes by $2,200. So it was a pretty broad-based tax cut, and the reason we did it temporarily was because of that budget rule.
Yes, sir. My name is Krishna Guha, and I'm on the mid-career program here at the Kennedy School. I wanted to ask you about the twin deficits idea, the notion that by cutting taxes and increasing the budget deficit, that has repercussions for the trade and current account. Do you accept that analysis that there is, you know, a direct causal relationship between these two? And are you concerned about the size of the trade deficit, or do you see it, as you were describing as the 1980s, as simply a positive symptom of capital from the rest of the world wishing to flow into the U.S.?
I don't think anybody really believes in the twin deficit theory anymore because it blew up, you know, in the Clinton years. I mean, in the Clinton years, we had very high budget surpluses, and yet we still had trade deficits. So, there, you know, if you run a correlation between these two things, it just doesn't seem to add up at all, that there's somehow some relationship between the trade deficit and the budget deficit. As far as your other question, I mean, it's interesting about the trade deficit. The trade deficit, if I had the chart, I wish I had it with me. The trade deficit goes down, if you look over the last 40 years, the only time the trade deficit goes down is when America's in recession. And the reason the trade deficit goes down when America's in recession is because consumers don't have money, so they're buying fewer foreign goods. When the economy is booming, as it did in the 90s and in the late 80s, the trade deficit goes up because Americans are feeling, wealthier, and they are wealthier. So I don't lose sleep over the trade deficit. You know, the trade deficit is not very well calculated. If I could change anything about economic journalism, I wouldn't even report on the trade deficit. I think it's a totally meaningless statistic. Remember, as I said before, the trade deficit is the mirror image of a capital surplus. And one of the it's true that we are importing more than we're exporting in terms of manufacturing goods, but we're also importing more capital. I mean, I was just in Jackson, Mississippi about 3 weeks ago, and we're driving down the highway, and there is a plant in Jackson, Mississippi. It was enormous. It was like 6 blocks long. And it was this huge new Honda factory that's just been built in Jackson, Mississippi. Well, that's a result of this capital importing into the country. And when we import capital, that basically creates jobs here.
Okay, that's the gentleman right here.
My name is Connor Wilson. I'm a freshman at the college.
Hello.
The Club for Growth has played a rather interesting role in some different races in the past years, whether it's an advertisement for Howard Dean as a Volvo driver or actually funding Republican candidates to run against Republican incumbents. Mm-hmm. What role do you see the Club for Growth playing in this 2004 election?
Good question also. Some of you may have seen there was a front page story in both the New York Times and the Washington Post on today's Wednesday that basically said that there's these groups like, you all familiar with like MoveOn.org and groups like that, that they now have about $75 million in their coffers to run anti-Bush ads and to try to get Kerry elected. I'm all for that. I mean, I'm all for groups raising money if they want to run ads. There hasn't been a response from the right, and so we hope to be the group that goes to those big Republican donors and say, wait a minute, you know, you're going to let George Soros give $15 million to move on, you know, give us some money so we can run ads, attacking Kerry and propping up Bush, and I think we will. And your question is a good one because the campaign finance rules affect us very directly. And I would just say this about the campaign finance law. I don't know if you all are opposed to it or think it was a good thing, but if the objective of the campaign finance law was to sort of take big money out of politics, folks, it ain't working, because you're going to see probably 2 to 3 times more money spent in this election year than when Bush ran against Gore in 2000.
What about his question about taking Republicans off?
Oh. You asked the tough ones, yeah. No, I think this is an important point too. I mean, this is really the genesis of what the Club for Growth is about, which is to impose discipline within the party. My good friend Bob Novak always says that the only reason Republicans were put on this earth is to cut taxes. So if they're not going to cut taxes, then we don't need them. And so yet there are a lot of Republicans who don't want to do that. And so what we try to do is find the ones who don't want to cut taxes and replace them with those who do. The reason that it's important to have these kind of fights within the party, and you'll probably concur with this because you were a member of Congress yourself. Most congressional districts are safe Republican districts or safe Republican districts from the time they're drawn. So out of the 435 House races this year, guess what? 400 of them are decided well before November 6th, except for those rare occasions like the 1994 election where you had this huge massive tide. And so what we sort of discovered is, look, if you want to affect elections, let's not, and so all the money pours into those 35 races that are sort of the battleground races. We said, well, let's get involved in some of these primaries where we can really pick the winners, and that's been sort of the market niche of the Club for Growth. Yes.
I'm Andrew. I'm a prospective student at Harvard. I liked what you had to say about how the capital gains tax acts as a drag force on the economy. And I know a lot of people have proposed actually eliminating it altogether. And I was wondering, though, if that doesn't go far enough, and if, given all the prospective benefits to small businesses, if you'd be in favor of a negative capital gains tax of 5 or 10%.
Actually, it's really funny you should mention that because my mentor, Arthur Laffer, famous from the Laffer curve, who I do a lot of work with, often says that, the correct rate of capital gains is like negative 5%. I'll be very happy with 0. And, look, it's important to understand why the correct rate of capital gains tax is 0. If you're going to tax the corporation on the profits, right, you shouldn't tax the profits in the stock. In other words, remember, going back to this idea of what determines the valuation of the stock, it's the earnings over time. So when you sell your stock for a gain, you're basically selling it on the basis of what the earnings are going to be in the future. But if you tax those earnings at that time too, do you see why that's a double tax on the same stream of income? And so we ought to get that tax down to 0, and that's why we ought to have the ideal thing would be to have a consumption tax. We ought to just have a national sales tax that just taxes consumption when people actually make their purchases. If we did that, my God, that would be like rocket fuel for the economy. We'd have like 8% growth.
This gentleman back here.
Sir.
Yeah, hi, my name is Brandon Del Pozo. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. As a novice investor, I think one of the reasons why you needed a ringer to tell you how stocks were valued, and I'm hoping you can clarify this, is because after the bubble, I think nobody really knew how stocks were valued, certainly not by earnings, which brings me to the second point I was hoping you could address, which is I understand why stocks had to go up based on your explanation of the tax cut, but it seems that they went up for the least robust and important way, which because the government is putting money back into the tax transactions that surround stocks. I was wondering how this would help stocks go up in the most important way, which is because if you say that they're valued by earnings, that companies are more robust and earning more. I think that would be a greater point.
And that it has that effect too. I mean, if all of a sudden, you cut the dividend tax or the capital gains tax, now the cost for the company to raise capital is significantly reduced. Another thing that we did in the tax cut was that we for new business investment, which is so important to creating jobs, for small businesses, we said, for your first, I forget the number, $50,000 of investment, guess what? You don't have to pay a tax on that investment. That has had a very positive effect on business investment spending. If you look at the statistics on what's happened to business investment spending over the last year and a half, the numbers are really very positive. That's one of the reasons I'm pretty bullish on the economy right now.
We have 3 more here, and I'd like you each to ask your question, and then
That's a
we'll
good
hold the
idea.
answers till we get them all, because that way we're running a little bit short
Sure.
of time.
I'm Michael New. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. And my question for you, Steve, is that you've been advising Arnold Schwarzenegger on California fiscal policy. And part of the reason why California isn't as bad at fiscal shape as it is because spending has increased so quickly under Gray Davis. My question for you is, why do you think Governor Schwarzenegger abandoned his commitment to a constitutional spending limit?
Okay, we'll hold that. Yes, sir.
I would like to ask a question.
Your name.
Oh, sorry. My name is Herman Sood, and I'm at the Mass General and the Medical School. I was impressed by the emphasis that you placed on the enormous import of the extremely wealthy, and they are the ones that are giving jobs. And my question to you is, why should we not take these most extremely worthy citizens and give them zero tax? Kind of like this other chap, or maybe a reward for being so noble and virtuous.
Okay, good question. This young lady right here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Elaine Regis, and I'm a mid-career student here, and one of the very few Republicans, too. And my question is, the politicians talk a lot about the rich and the elite, and I was wondering if you could put a number to that to let us know what exactly is the salary income level that determines what a wealthy person is. Thanks.
Okay. And
All right.
Last question.
Yeah, my name is Greg Wilson. I work here at the Kennedy School. 30 years ago, the average CEO made 25 times what a worker makes. Today, they make 500 times what a worker makes. And 10 years ago, 33 million Americans didn't have health insurance.
Yeah.
Today, 43 million Americans don't have health insurance. Obviously, the class war waged by the poor against the rich has failed. I was wondering if you could tell us what type of impact your emphasis on taxation on the stock market can help the working class, because studies show 90% of all stocks are owned by the richest 10%.
Okay, I'll
So you
do these very
try to
quickly
as
because I know.
fast as you can.
On the California situation, it's a real challenge to get Arnold Schwarzenegger to cut the budget, and they've got a $15 billion deficit. So he doesn't want to cut the budget if he doesn't have to, and I think that's the reason why he didn't do the spending limitation measure. But necessity is what's going to force him to do that because of the huge deficit. What was the next question? That was about the.
Well, somebody wanted to know how you defined.
What's the cutoff for the rich?
And then also, why not just tax
Right.
people at 0%?
On the cutoff for the rich, I don't know what a good answer to that question is. I mean, everybody has different definitions of what a rich person is. Some people say it's 100,000. Some people say it's 250,000. I mean, in a lot of these states, people say, the governors say, we're only going to raise taxes on rich people, those who make over 100,000. Well, I'm not sure that's rich. I mean, in a lot of states like California and New York, a $100,000 or $120,000 income as a school teacher married to a bus driver. So, I don't know, $1 million a year I think might be a good cutoff for the rich. In terms of your point about why not lower, I wasn't quite sure I understood it. I guess what I would like to see is a system where the tax rates are lowered as much as possible. That's why I believe in a flat tax system with a very generous zero bracket. So say your first $20,000 of income is not taxed, but then everyone pays the same share of tax above that amount. I believe, and this is an ethical statement, that if you make 10 times as much income as I do, you should pay 10 times as much tax as I do, not 20 or 30 or 40 times more than I do. So I guess that would be my answer to that. And the last question was about, about the CEO salaries,
And the health insurance.
And the health insurance. Well, health care, I can't get into that. I mean, we can talk about that privately because it's a very complicated subject. I have some very strong opinions on it. But I'll say this about CEO salaries. This gets to the issue of shareholder power. I agree with you that in a lot of cases, these CEO salaries are totally outrageous. And what you need is ways that shareholders, because after all, the shareholders are the owners of the company, that they can rebel against these, outrageous salaries. Look, I don't have a problem with paying, Bill Gates, whatever it is he's making, if the company is making us a profit. But there are a lot of cases where these companies are practically going under, and the CEOs are still paying themselves $100 million a year, which gets to the point of one of the things that people need to appreciate is why the kind of corporate raiders and so on are so important, because the old Michael Milkens of the world, those were the people who could go in and say, you know what, these CEOs and managers are paying themselves millions and millions of dollars a year, and they're not adding a penny of value to the company. And so you need a way to kind of inject competition into those companies to get rid of those abuses by CEOs.
I'm going to take the prerogative of the last question, if you would. And this is, the Republican Party is known as the party of fiscal responsibility. But I was in Congress during the Reagan years, and Reagan vetoed the fewest number of appropriations bills of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. And now we have a situation in Congress where discretionary spending has gone up faster under the Republican Congress and a Republican president than it went up previously, much faster. And, you know, I always have kind of felt that no matter what you try to do, there are certain basic things Republicans or Democrats will try to spend money on. Farm programs, medical care, highways, and it doesn't matter who the president is or what the philosophy is. With a rare exception, most members of Congress are going to want to do those kinds of things. So it strikes me, I just ask you this question, in light of what you've said, has fiscal responsibility just gone down the tubes? Is there any such thing as fiscal responsibility anymore? And can President Bush even run on the platform of being fiscally responsible? After all, the entire federal government is run by one party right now.
Well, Mr. Secretary, is this a trick question? No, because of course, you know, I mean, the answer is so self-evident. You're exactly right. I mean, there is no fiscal responsibility. Republicans have become an embarrassment. They've run away from a lot of the things. You know, I mentioned that I worked with Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey in 1994. One of the central things that we said we were going to do was to balance the budget. And I think this is what happens when you have people in power too long. I think that one of the healthiest things that happened for this government was in 1995, notwithstanding losing good people like you, but the changeover in the power in Congress, because I do think that after however long it had been, 50 years of Democrat control, it had become a kind of corrupt institution. And so there was this kind of new invigoration that came in with the Republicans. But after 10 years, they've sort of run out of gas, and they are just holding on to the power for having the power itself. I think that, you know, my solution to a lot of this is I'm a big, big believer in term limits. I think if you had term limits in Congress where these people came and served for 6 and 8 years and then went back out of government and got real jobs, I think it would be a really healthy thing for our political system because, you know, Lord Acton said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.